The silence was suffocating. Only the crackle of burning debris broke the stillness as Mason, Hitman, Hayes surveyed the ruins of the once thriving colony. Charred remains of buildings leaned like broken teeth against the ashen sky, and the air stank of scorched metal and death. A child's toy, an old, singed teddy bear, caught his eye, lying half buried in the rubble. It was a tiny relic of innocence amidst the devastation, a symbol of what was stolen in the Zarkon's brutal attack. Mason's grip tightened around his rifle as memories surged. He'd saved that child during an evacuation mission 6 months ago, pulling her from the chaos of an alien raid. Now, the blood of innocence stained the ground, evidence of the alien's merciless nature. But something far darker stirred within Mason. He wasn't just on a mission, this was personal. "Commander, it's worse than we thought." The voice crackled through Mason's earpiece. It was Dr. Voss, the mission's scientific advisor, his tone flat but edged with tension. "The aliens left a message, a warning. They don't just intend to conquer, they're sending a message. They want us to suffer." Commander Reeves' voice responded over the comms, hard as steel. "Hayes, I know this hits close to home, but don't let your emotions compromise the mission. We need intel, not a vendetta." Mason's jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the broken remnants of the colony. "We gather intel. Then we send them a message of our own, one they won't forget." His voice was as cold as the alien sky above. Commander Reeves sighed, knowing there was no stopping Mason once he set his mind. "Fine. We're greenlighting the mission. But remember, Mason, this isn't just about revenge." Mason's silence was answer enough. The team moved quickly through the ruins, sweeping for any survivors or clues to the Zarkon's next move. Mason led them with ruthless efficiency. His years as a Special Forces operative had honed him into a weapon, a man whose emotions were buried under layers of discipline and experience. But this mission was different. The faces of the dead haunted him at every turn, fueling a fire he barely kept in check. The Zarkon warlords were not just enemies. They were predators, reveling in the slaughter of the weak. They had no regard for negotiations or treaties. They only understood power and pain. Mason intended to give them a lesson in both. As they neared the colony's command center, Dr. Voss uncovered a data core half buried beneath twisted metal. "This could be it," he murmured, working swiftly to decrypt the information. "Coordinates. It looks like they're planning another strike, something bigger, more coordinated." "Where?" Mason demanded, his eyes narrowing as the tension rose. Before Voss could respond, a blinding flash of light cut through the smoke, followed by the shriek of Zarkon war cries. Mason's instincts kicked in. "Ambush!" he shouted, diving behind cover as plasma bolts scorched the ground where he'd stood. The rest of the team scrambled, returning fire as the air filled with the acrid scent of burning ozone. Mason's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was icy calm. This was what he was made for, war in its rawest form. He scanned the battlefield, searching for the warlord in command of the ambush. If he could take him down, it might just turn the tide in their favor. As the battle raged, Mason spotted the towering silhouette of the Zarkon commander, a hulking creature with eyes that glowed like embers. This was the monster that had ordered the slaughter, the one Mason had sworn to kill. But just as Mason lined up his shot, the warlord's gaze met his, and a sinister grin split its face. The warlord barked an order, and more alien troops poured in from the shadows. They were outnumbered, outgunned. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in Mason's mind. But it was drowned out by the resolve burning in his chest. "Hold the line!" he roared, firing into the advancing horde. This battle wasn't just a fight for survival. It was the beginning of his reckoning. The smoke hung thick in the air, a grim curtain obscuring the battlefield. Mason's breaths were ragged as he and his team fought to hold their position against the relentless wave of Zarkon troops. Plasma bolts crackled past, lighting the ruins in brief flashes of violent light. Each second felt like an eternity, and with every shot fired, Mason's resolve hardened. "We're getting overwhelmed here," barked Sergeant Cole, his voice strained as he ducked behind a crumbling wall. "We can't keep this up forever, Mason." Mason didn't respond immediately, eyes locked on the Zarkon warlord in the distance. The alien's twisted grin was still seared into his mind, a mocking reminder of everything they'd lost. "We hold until Voss gets that data," he finally shouted back. He wasn't just talking about the mission anymore, this was personal. This warlord would fall, no matter the cost. But as the fighting raged on, something gnawed at Mason, an old feeling he hadn't let himself acknowledge in years: doubt. He'd always been the hammer, smashing through obstacles with brute force and determination. But this time, that might not be enough. They were outnumbered, and reinforcements were still light years away. The odds were against them, and deep down, Mason knew it. "Data's decrypted." Dr. Voss's voice cut through the chaos like a lifeline. "Coordinates confirmed. They're setting up a forward base near Alpha Prime. If we can hit them before they're fully established, we can cripple their entire invasion strategy." Mason finished, determination reigniting in his eyes. The mission parameters snapped back into focus. "We've got what we came for. Prepare to exfil." Just then, a blast rocked the ground beneath them, sending debris flying. The Zarkon warlord had fired a mortar, its explosive impact obliterating what was left of their cover. Mason's ears rang as he stumbled to his feet, vision swimming. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The warlord strode forward, towering and confident, its crimson eyes gleaming with savage intent. It barked orders in its guttural tongue, and the alien soldiers redoubled their assault. Mason's mind raced. They couldn't win a prolonged firefight, not here. His mission instincts kicked in. "Sergeant Cole, lay down suppressive fire. Voss, get the intel secured and prep for extraction." Cole's gun blazed, forcing the Zarkon back momentarily, but the cost was evident. Ammo was running low, and every missed shot was a nail in their coffin. Dr. Voss frantically worked to lock down the data core, fingers moving with frantic precision. Mason knew that if they failed to extract, humanity would face an even graver threat, a war they weren't ready to fight. But retreating now would mean letting the warlord escape, and the thought twisted like a knife in Mason's gut. This creature had orchestrated the massacre that fueled his fury, and he couldn't stomach the idea of it walking away unscathed. The warlord locked eyes with Mason again, that infuriating grin splitting its face. It was daring him, taunting him with its arrogance. For a heartbeat, Mason considered abandoning the mission plan, charging headlong into the fray to put a bullet between the alien's eyes. He could end it here, make the warlord pay for every innocent life it had taken. The rage surged, nearly blinding him to reason. "Mason!" Cole's voice snapped him back to reality. "We need to move, now!" Mason's hands tightened around his rifle. Strategy or vengeance, he could only choose one. With a heavy breath, he made the call. "Fall back to the extraction point. We complete the mission." They fought their way out, every step feeling like a bitter surrender. The warlord watched them go, the grin never leaving its face. It knew this wasn't over, and so did Mason. As they retreated into the dense smoke, Mason couldn't shake the warlord's mocking expression. His mission was far from finished. He'd chosen strategy over vengeance this time, but he silently vowed that he'd be back, and next time, he wouldn't leave until the warlord was dead. The hum of the dropship's engines was a low, steady drone as it streaked through the cloud-filled sky, cutting a path toward Alpha Prime. Inside the cabin, tension crackled like electricity. Mason stared at the tactical map projected in front of him, analyzing the last-minute intel Dr. Voss had decrypted. The coordinates of the Zarkon's new base were right in the heart of enemy-controlled territory, just as they'd feared. "We're walking straight into a kill zone," Sergeant Cole muttered, tightening the straps on his armor. "They'll be expecting us." Mason's jaw clenched. He knew Cole was right. The warlord wasn't just some mindless brute. It was a cunning strategist who'd anticipated human counterattacks before. This mission wasn't just about raw firepower. It was a test of nerve, cunning, and who could outthink the other. "We don't have a choice," Mason replied, his voice edged with steely resolve. "If we don't strike now, they'll entrench themselves, and we'll be fighting an uphill war." Cole nodded, but there was a glimmer of doubt in his eyes. He trusted Mason's instincts, but the stakes were higher than ever. One wrong move and they'd all be wiped out. For Mason, the thought of retreating was unbearable, not after everything the Zarkon had done. But this wasn't about personal revenge anymore. It was about protecting humanity's future. Dr. Voss leaned in, her eyes scanning the map. I've identified a potential weak point, a narrow ravine on the eastern flank. It's risky, but if we can breach it, we'll bypass most of their defenses. Mason studied the coordinates. It was a gamble, but it was the kind of calculated risk that could turn the tide. We split into 2 teams, he decided. Cole, you lead a diversionary assault from the west. Draw their fire and keep them focused on you. Voss and I will take the ravine and strike from the blind spot. Cole gave a grim smile. Running headfirst into fire, just the kind of distraction I'm good at. Just don't get yourself killed. Mason shot back with a rare hint of humor, though his eyes were sharp with focus. We need you alive! The dropship descended, skimming treetops as it closed in on the landing zone. The soldiers readied their gear, each one aware that the next few hours would determine the course of the war. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife, yet beneath it lay a fierce determination. This was humanity's chance to strike back, on their terms. The moment they touched down, the teams sprang into action. Cole's unit moved with precision, laying down suppressive fire as they made their push toward the enemy's western defenses. Explosions rocked the battlefield, and the Zarkon forces responded with brutal efficiency, falling right into the trap. Mason could almost hear the Warlords sneer in his mind, confident that it had predicted every move. But Mason's real play was happening on the other side of the battlefield. He and Voss crept through the narrow ravine, the sound of distant gunfire echoing off the stone walls. Every step was deliberate, every breath controlled. Mason's senses were on high alert. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Voss followed closely, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. There it is, Voss whispered, pointing to a heavily shielded communications array tucked behind a rock outcropping. That's their command hub. If we take it out, their entire network will collapse. Mason's heart pounded as he sized up the target. They had one shot, no margin for error. He signaled Voss to set the charges, every second dragging like an eternity. Suddenly, a shadow loomed at the edge of his vision. Mason spun around just in time to see a Zarkon scout emerging from the gloom, its eyes narrowing as it spotted them. His finger tightened on the trigger, then the scene cut to black. The crack of a rifle cut through the silence, its echo bouncing off the jagged walls of the ravine. Mason's reflexes were razor-sharp as he squeezed the trigger, sending the Zarkon scouts sprawling into the dust. But the damage was done, the element of surprise was lost. In the distance, alarms wailed, the piercing sound of alien war cries filling the air. Mason didn't flinch, he was too focused, too determined. This was their final shot, and he would see it through. Charges are set! Dr. Voss yelled over the growing cacophony, her hands trembling as she double-checked the detonator. Her face was pale, but there was a fierce light in her eyes, the kind that came from having everything to lose and nothing left to fear. Get ready to blow it on my mark! Mason barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. He wasn't sure how many Zarkon would pour into the ravine, but it didn't matter. All they had to do was hold the line long enough for Cole's diversionary attack to push through. The first wave hit like a sledgehammer. Zarkon warriors, hulking and armored, charged into the narrow ravine with relentless fury. Mason's rifle barked in short, controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. Beside him, Voss ducked behind a boulder, her fingers hovering nervously over the detonator. Come on, Cole! Mason muttered under his breath as he reloaded. You better not be late. On the other side of the battlefield, Cole's team fought tooth and nail, driving deeper into the enemy's defenses. They'd drawn most of the Warlords' forces away from the command hub, but not without cost. The ground was littered with debris, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning metal. Cole gritted his teeth as he plowed forward, refusing to let up, even as exhaustion gnawed at his limbs. Back in the ravine, the pressure was mounting. Mason's ammo was running low, and the Zarkon were adapting, their attacks becoming more coordinated and ferocious. It was only a matter of time before they were overrun. "Now, Voss!" Mason shouted, his voice raw with urgency. Voss slammed her thumb on the detonator, and for a split second, the world held its breath. Then the ground shook violently as the explosives detonated, sending a shockwave through the ravine. Rocks and debris cascaded down, crushing several Zarkon beneath tons of rubble. The command hub shield flickered, then shattered in a burst of sparks. Mason didn't waste a moment. He surged forward, taking advantage of the chaos, and unleashed a volley of rounds straight into the heart of the hub's control panel. The screens exploded in a shower of sparks, and with it, the Zarkon's centralized command network collapsed. Across the battlefield, the enemy's forces faltered, their coordination breaking down into disarray. "They're falling back!" Voss shouted, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "It's working!" But Mason knew better than to celebrate too soon. This wasn't just about disrupting communications, it was about making a statement. He knew the Warlord would be furious, and that anger would make it reckless. This was their moment to drive the final nail into the Zarkon's coffin. "Cole's status?" Mason called into his comms, his voice strained. "We're breaking through," came the reply, Cole's voice crackling with adrenaline. "They're in full retreat." Mason's lips curled into a grim smile. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the turning point they needed. "Good. Regroup and prepare for Phase 2. We're taking the fight straight to their Warlord." As the dust settled, Mason felt the weight of the moment. They'd come so far, and now the endgame was in sight. But with every victory, the stakes only grew higher. The war wasn't over, this was just the beginning of the final chapter. "Let's finish this," Mason said quietly, his eyes cold and determined. Voss nodded beside him, her fear replaced by a resolute calm. Together, they marched forward, ready to face whatever came next.